Welcome back. I want to shift our focus a bit eastward and talk about Russia, Russian history. We'll call this Russian absolutism. The context, Russia is part of both European and Asian history. The significance, well, Russia is kind of an exception in this case to European history. It has distinct differences. So we want to look at these differences, and we want to concentrate mainly on some of the enduring themes of Russian history. There's four I'm going to talk about. Russian geography, Russian history, briefly, the repeated attempts to try to modernize Russia, and then the long-standing conflict between the Russian elite and the vast Russian peasantry. So let's start with Russian geography. This is a country of northern latitudes. It borders the Arctic. If you follow latitude lines in Russia around to the Western Hemisphere, you'll find yourself in Canada. Russia is the largest country in the world in square miles. It extends, it extends from Europe all the way to the Bering Strait. It extends from the Arctic all the way to China and Central Asia. The continental United States has what, 4 time zones? Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. Russia has 11 time zones, to give you some sense of its immense size. Russia shares borders with more countries than any other nation. I counted it one time years ago in graduate school. It's like 14. Can you imagine? The United States borders 2 countries, Canada and Mexico. We're not threatened by either. Can you imagine sharing borders with 14 other countries? Completely different languages and traditions and religious practices and cuisines and everything. It doesn't take much imagination to see that bordering 14 other nations could be troublesome, could invite political conflict. The core of Russia, that is geographically where most of the Russians live, is what we would think of as east of Poland and west of the Ural Mountains. You can look at the map and you see the Urals run north and south. They're east of Moscow. So that area between Poland, or the Baltic Sea, and the Urals, that's where most of the Russian people actually live. Most Russian rivers either flow north into the Arctic or they flow south into the Black Sea or the great inland sea, the Caspian Sea. The other factor about Russian geography that's interesting is that it has the longest coastline of any country in the world. Ironically, this coastline is basically useless because most of it's in the Arctic. And without icebreakers, you can't utilize that waterway. And of course, and for most of Russia's history, there were no icebreakers. We have them today. So the fact that Russia is sort of hemmed in by these 14 nations that border it on the west, south, and east, and then it's hemmed in the north by the ice, by the Arctic Sea. So it's landlocked, essentially. One of the incentives for Russian expansion is to gain access to the open waters. If you follow the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way to its end, you'll find Vladivostok, the Russian city on the Pacific, founded specifically because of the ice there is not year-round, and Russian shipping can gain access to the open seas. You see Russia continually puts pressure southward around the Black Sea against Turkey and the Crimea. There's been a traditional longing by the Russians to gain access to the Bosphorus. So they have access to the Mediterranean, and then from there, of course, the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. And then, of course, St. Petersburg is built on the Baltic to allow Russia access to the open seas there. Now, a bit of Russian history. Russia has peculiarities in its history. One is that it was dominated by the Mongols. We talked about the Mongols earlier in this course. As the Mongols expanded their empire westward, they overran the Russians in the 14th century. There's a traditional fear, especially among the Russian elite, of enemy encirclement, again, surrounded by distinctly different cultures, and a lot of them, from China in the east all the way to Scandinavia in the west. Russian history is dominated by this sort of creeping expansion. If you could look at an animated map of Russia from its beginnings to today, you will see that it's constantly changing shape. It reminds me of Israel a little bit in this case. Of course, Israel's tiny, and Russia is immense, but Russia expands and contracts, expands and contracts. There has been a tendency in Russian history to push against these boundaries, both in Europe, South Asia, and in the Far East. We'll talk about some of the Russian rulers, just a couple of them here. Ivan the Great, he throws off the Mongol oppression, the Mongol yoke over the Russians in 1480, and is sort of looked at as a founding father of Russia. The Russian leader is called the Tsar. This is taken, it means emperor, and it's taken obviously from the old Roman Caesar. The Russian alphabet, devised by scholars of the Byzantine Empire. Russia claims to be the third Rome, that is the third repository of Christianity. Rome having fallen in antiquity, and then of course the Byzantine Empire falls to Islam in the 1450s. And so Christianity is shifting eastward and now northward from Rome to Constantinople and now to Moscow. Ivan the Terrible, you probably heard of. Conflict. Ivan the Terrible, this is a time of troubles, as they call it in Russian history, where there's a conflict as to where the power resides, with the Tsar or with his nobility, the Russian nobility called the Boyars, B-O-Y-A-R-S. Now, the Romanov family will take power in Russia in 1610. The Romanovs, the great dynasty that will last for 3 centuries to the First World War, when the last of the Romanovs are assassinated by the Bolsheviks. Peter the Great, we should mention briefly, late 17th, early 18th centuries. He sought to modernize Russia. Again, this is one of those themes in Russian history that we need to think about. Peter traveled to Europe incognito in an attempt to see how the Europeans did things, their military institutions, their naval yards and industry. He wanted to see these European models and then try to take them back to Russia to help modernize his country. He's not interested in domestic institutions or institutions of representative government or democracy. He's interested in the military and industrial institutions. He imposes a beard tax on the Russian farmer. The traditional beard worn by Russian farmers, in Peter's opinion, makes Russia look backward. So he imposes a tax. If you want to wear a beard, you're going to have to pay for it. And of course, when Peter goes to when he goes to Europe and takes his tour, I said he went incognito. This, of course, is very difficult for him. I think Peter is something like 6'7", easily the tallest man in Europe, I would think. It's hard to go incognito when you tower above everyone. He tries to modernize the Russian bureaucracy. He creates what is called the table of ranks to try to bring some order to the nobility and their place in the government. He conquers the Baltic states, and he creates the city of St. Petersburg. Much of the 20th century, St. Petersburg will be called Leningrad, Lenin's city. It will revert to St. Petersburg after the fall of the Soviet Union. Quick word about Catherine the Great, who ruled in the latter part of the 18th century. She regarded herself as an enlightened despot, and we will talk about the Enlightenment here. She's a German princess married into the Romanov family. She conspires with Russian nobility to have the Tsar, her husband, killed, and then she takes over from him and rules for, again, the latter part of the 18th century. I said she was an enlightened despot. She likes to think of herself as a benevolent ruler, current with Enlightenment ideas. This tendency, this inclination on Catherine's part will be halted by what's called Pugachev's rebellion. This will turn her from less an enlightened despot into a more security-minded one. And then, of course, like I said, and we'll talk about this later, the Romanov dynasty will end in 1917 when Tsar Nicholas II steps down. He abdicates the throne, and then, of course, he and his family will be murdered just the next year. The other theme I want to talk about here is Russian modernization. Again, this is a long-running theme in Russian history. Up until the 20th century, the only source of capital in Russia was the grain that's grown there in Ukraine and other parts of southwestern Russia. So Russia's strategy to modernize has always rested on the government's ability, whether this is the Tsarist government or the communist. It's always rested on the ability of the government to take the grain away from the peasants and then use that grain to trade for managers and chemists and engineers and people and institutions that could help modernize the country. The problem, of course, is that the peasants do not willingly give up their grain. They'll burn it to keep the bureaucrats from getting it. They'll sell it on the black market to keep it out of the government's hands. They'll bury it under the ground to keep the government from getting it. So this creates just an incredible bitterness and suspicion between the Russian elite, again, whether it's Tsar or communist, and the Russian farmer. And this will come up again when we get into the 20th century. We'll talk about Stalin and his attempt to modernize Russia and to take the grain in order to do so. And then finally, that conflict, that tension between the Russian elite and the Russian peasant. Just a few words here. The Russian elite traditionally have spoken French. And of course the Russian peasant speaks Russian. So there's a language difference here. The Russian elite are concerned with feeding the industrial workers, the urban workers. You can't have cities unless you have surrounding farmland that can feed those city workers. Again, this gets back to modernization. The Russian elite always look to take the peasants' grain to feed this urban proletariat and to trade for industry. Of course, the Russian peasants seek to keep their grain. So there's a lot of tension in Russian history. A sense of encirclement, a sense of, even though it's an immense country, being confined by many other nations and geographically confined, and then this sense of being backward, of having to use its one source of capital, its grain, to try to trade with the Europeans and the Japanese and others, to try to modernize the country. When we get to the 20th century, the Great War and then the Bolshevik Revolution and then Stalin, we'll see these themes sort of come to fruition during the creation of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up again next time. Thank you.